Gonzaga and Oregon intentionally scheduled a non-conference matchup against each other? Hell must really have frozen over.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control over your finances by using Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com and you'll get 50% off your first year. Well, folks, Gonzaga and St. Mary's are in a recruiting battle for a 4-star talent. We're going to talk about that and why the Gaels might have the edge, at least for now. But first, we're going to talk scheduling for Gonzaga. We got some big-time news on Tuesday evening about a game Gonzaga is scheduling in late December. We're going to talk about that and what it might mean for another game we were expecting to see on the schedule this season that might not end up coming to fruition. We'll start talking about the news reported by John Rothstein on Tuesday evening. Gonzaga and Oregon. Dana Altman and the Ducks set to square off with the Zags on December 21st. At the Moda Center in Portland, Oregon. This was again reported by John Rothstein. It has not been confirmed by either team as of yet. But typically, if Rothstein is reporting games, they tend to be, he doesn't tend to do that unless they're actually happening. So we feel pretty good about this game happening again. December 21st in Portland at the Moda Center between Gonzaga and Oregon. The time of the game, ticketing information, TV, all that stuff will be revealed at a later date. For those who have been tracking this stuff, we've seen Gonzaga's announcement about opponents like Oklahoma and UCLA tend to come as much as a month or 6 weeks after we initially hear about the game. So I wouldn't expect to hear any updates about ticket information and things like that between these two teams anytime super soon. But obviously, in the cases of the UCLA and Oklahoma games, the reported date and matchups were what ended up happening. So we are expecting that this is going to be the deal. And the reason that we're like hesitant about, is this actually happening, is because these two teams do not play each other. It is a well-known, heavily documented fact that Gonzaga and Oregon, in the entire tenure of Mark Few's history, have not willingly scheduled a game against each other. They have played twice. Both of the times they played were as part of an MTE, a multi-team event. So that's why I say willingly. It does not mean that they are like anti-playing each other or anything, but they've signed up for the same events. But they have not chosen to schedule a game specifically against each other since 1984 was the last time that these two teams played each other in that type of environment. It's also the last time that they played each other on the mainland, because the two games that have happened since Mark Few took over as head coach in 1999, one of them happened in 1999 against Hawaii. That was on December 29th, 99. And Oregon won that, Oregon won that game 70-64. And then 20 years later on November 28th, 2019, in the battle for Atlantis down in the Bahamas, Gonzaga beat Oregon. That was an overtime win for the Zags over the Ducks, 73-72 for that one. Those are the only times these two teams have played each other since Mark Few took over as the head coach. And as a reminder for those of you who need it, or maybe a new fact for some of you who did not know this, Mark Few is a graduate from the University of Oregon. He began his college tenure at Linfield, was attempting to walk on to a couple of their sporting teams, I think the football team and then their baseball team. And then he had a shoulder injury, decided to transfer to Oregon and looked into walking onto their baseball team. And then before he got to Oregon, they disbanded their baseball team and brought it back about a decade or so ago. So Mark Few just ended up being a quote unquote regular student at Oregon. But I'm assuming that has something to do with these two teams having not scheduled each other. I don't know if there's other factors. I think I remember reading in Bud Withers' phenomenal book, Glory Hounds, about Gonzaga, that there was a lot of programs that very heavily pursued Mark Few to be their next head coach in the early mid-aughts, back when he had that early success in his career and was still kind of perhaps impressionable enough to move on. I think Oregon was in that mix. I think Indiana was in that mix. There's a few others as well. So that could be a contributing factor for these two teams having not squared off, but now they are. And it's going to be a great matchup between two phenomenal programs. And Oregon's been pretty up and down over the last couple of decades. They've had some really, really highs and some real lows where they haven't been very good, but they've been consistently solid under Dana Altman, who's been the head coach there for now over a decade. And coming off of a really successful year last year, where they went 25-10. They went 12-8 in the Big Ten. New conference, new travel schedule, very, very good league with teams like Purdue and Michigan State. And this team went 12-8, very solid, finished 7th, but they earned a 5 seed. I think that tells you a lot about the strength of the Big Ten, or at least the perceived strength of the Big Ten. This team beat Liberty, the 12 seed, by 29 points in the first round. It was a trendy 12-5 upset that backfired almost immediately. And then they lost to Arizona, a Big Ten versus Big 12 battle between two former Pac-12 foes in a 4 versus 5 matchup that ended up being a phenomenal game. Arizona won that one by 4. So that was where Oregon was at last year, and they're trending towards being in a very good spot as well this season. Most places that have done their preseason rankings at this point, or even they're way too early, just after the season finished rankings, have Oregon as a top 10 or top 15, top 20 team, pretty consistent with where Gonzaga has been showing up. And for good reason. Oregon managed to return some really key pieces to their roster. Nate Biddle is back. Nate Biddle's a name that might be familiar to some of you Gonzaga fans who follow recruiting closely, because Gonzaga was looking at Nate Biddle, who's from Oregon, from the state of Oregon, as a recruit. At around the same time, they were looking at Ben Gregg, and they ended up ultimately getting Ben Gregg. Biddle goes to Oregon. He's been there for a long time, dealt with some injuries, but was really productive last year. Averaged about 14 points, 7.5 boards, and just over 2 blocks per game. He's a 7-footer. He's a big guy. He plays around the rim, but he can also step out and knock down outside shots. Really talented player. They get him back after his waiver was approved. They also get Jackson Shellstad back for his junior year. He's a guard from West Lynn who was excellent as a freshman and even better as a sophomore, and primed to potentially break out as an All-American caliber player in his junior year. Last year averaged about 14 points and 3 assists, shot 38% from 3. And then they get KJ Evans back. Evans was kind of considered a potential one-and-done caliber player when he first committed to Oregon 2 years ago in that same class with Jackson Shellstad. I almost called him Peyton Pritchard. They are very similar players, for those of you who follow the two of them. They're quite similar in a lot of ways. Both went to West Lynn High School, both trending towards being 4-year guys at Oregon. Anyway, Evans in that class alongside Shellstad hasn't really quite been the caliber of player that a lot of Ducks fans thought he would be, but he's a very, very athletic 6'9" kind of stretch 4 type, average 6 points, 4.5 boards, very efficient, 58% on 2-pointers last year. They also bring in some transfers. Sean Stewart comes over to Ohio State. He started his career at Duke and then spent 1 year at Ohio State and is now going to be with the Ducks. Hasn't been very productive, but is a big man who has a lot of potential and upside. We'll see if Altman can unleash that. TK Simpsons comes over as one of the better mid-major players in the country last year at Elon, and then Devin Pryor coming over from Texas as well. This recruiting class that are the rising juniors for Oregon, Jackson Shellstad and KJ Evans in particular, also included an All-American, McDonald's All-American in Mookie Cook. Mookie Cook was also pursued heavily by Gonzaga out of the recruiting trail before committing to Oregon. He has since hit the transfer portal and is actually at the University of San Francisco. So Gonzaga is going to get to face, not only face Biddle and as well as Shellstad and Evans in this recruiting class, but they'll face Mookie Cook from that recruiting class with the Dons as well. Another fun wrinkle about this, before we move on and talk about what it means for Gonzaga's non-conference schedule as a whole, is that Oregon is also a part of the Players Era Festival. In fact, won the Players Era Festival last year, so pocketed that extra $1 in change for their NIL efforts. But now Gonzaga has games against both Creighton and Oregon, who are part of the Players Era Festival. I don't know this. I looked into it. I didn't see anything, and perhaps there is some reporting on this that I just happened to miss, but I don't know if the Players Era Festival is how diligently they'll work to prevent a matchup between teams in that third game. We already know Gonzaga's first 2 games are against Alabama and Maryland in the Players Era Festival, but we don't know who that third matchup will be against. It depends on how they do in those first games, whether they go 0-2 or 1-1 and 2-0, and then it depends on some other factors, margin, victory, etc. So I assume if Gonzaga is set to line up against Oregon, that they'll play Oregon or Creighton, regardless of anything else. But again, that game would be on November 26th, I believe, and they would have played Creighton on November 11th. So there's no way they're going to play Creighton twice in 2 weeks. That's insane. And similarly, if they were to play Oregon, they will be playing them again 3 weeks later at the Moda Center. So I am curious how that's going to work. We'll talk about Baylor here in a second, but Baylor also part of the Players Era Festival. So the more teams you rack up that are in that event, the more difficult scheduling gets. I'm curious, especially as in 2026, that event, by the way, is going to expand from 18 teams to 32 teams, which is a topic we haven't dug fully into yet on this show, but I'm planning to in the coming days. I'm interested how that's going to work to avoid, not only avoid conference matchups, which is just impossible with a 32-team field, but also to avoid potentially scheduling teams that are already going to play each other in the non-conference. Just gets a little bit more challenging. Regardless, this is another great opponent for Gonzaga to take on in the non-conference this year. And that's what I want to talk about next is what does this schedule look like for Gonzaga and why haven't we seen Baylor? Every time a new team gets added to the schedule, it seems less and less likely that Gonzaga is going to end up playing Baylor. And we got to start to really wonder, are Scott Drew and the Bears ducking Gonzaga after last year's 38-point massacre? We're going to talk about that coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, most people out there, they can't name all of their financial accounts or even what they're all worth, whether it's their 401ks, their properties, or their various investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. And that's why there's Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or on your phone. Monarch does the heavy lifting for you. You can link all of your accounts in just minutes, see clear data visuals, and get smart categorization of your spending, and just finally feel in control of your money. And you don't even have to touch a spreadsheet. My wife and I spend a lot of time making sure that our finances are together. We got a young kid at home. We got a guy who's got multiple different jobs here. You want to make sure you have all of that in control. And that's why we love Monarch, because it makes it so simple to review those finances together. We can both see our budgets. We can see the goals. We can see all of our spending activity in one place. So don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com using code LOCKEDONCollege. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still talking non-conference scheduling for Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs as we wait for the official reveal from the team. As I said on the show before, Gonzaga likes to be one of, if not the very last Division I team in college basketball to reveal their non-conference schedule. I don't know if they just think it's fun. I don't know if they truly are tinkering with their schedule up until the last minute, or if they know the schedule, they just don't like revealing it until the end. I'm not sure. It's probably a combination of multiple different things. I will say Gonzaga does seem fairly flexible with their schedule and willing to make adjustments towards the last minute. And so I think that's part of why we've seen some of those things happen. But I do think there is a reason that this Oregon game, which is a very marquee non-conference game to get added to a schedule in mid-August, I do think there's a reason. And that reason is I think Gonzaga expected a game against Baylor that's not going to happen. And it's not been confirmed. There are places out there that have reported that they believe or that they have heard that it has been reported to them that Gonzaga and Baylor is not going to happen for this year. Until either team reveals their non-conference schedule and the other is not on it, I will hold out some level of apprehension about whether that is fully valid or not. But it sure seems to be trending that way. I mean, at this point, Gonzaga's non-conference schedule is pretty darn close to finalized. There's been a game reported against Southern Utah on November 17th that has not been confirmed by either side, at least as of this recording. But assuming that the report that we saw about that is true, that would mean that Gonzaga has now filled 12 of their 13 non-conference slots for next season. Meaning that if Baylor was going to happen, that would be the final game on their schedule. So another thing we can do right now is if we do get another game added that's not the Southern Utah game, that's probably a pretty clear sign that the Baylor game's not happening or that the reporting about the Southern Utah game was inaccurate. Regardless, we've seen a lot of reports about Baylor's schedule. We know they're playing Washington. We know they're playing Louisville. We know some other difficult non-conference games that they have. We've seen a lot of reporting about Gonzaga's non-conference schedule, which we're going to fly through here in a second. But we haven't seen a report that these two teams are squaring off again. As a reminder, they squared off last year in the first game of the season for Gonzaga on opening night at the Spokane Arena. You probably don't need a reminder about this game because it was one of the best days of the year as Gonzaga beat Baylor by 38 points in a complete and utter destruction of that team that ultimately ended up telling us a little bit more about Baylor than I think that it did about Gonzaga. Baylor still ended up getting a 9 seed last year and was fine, but they never really gelled as a team the way that a lot of people thought they would. Meanwhile, Gonzaga never really replicated that same level of success that they had in that Baylor game throughout the rest of the season. It unfortunately wasn't a sign of things to come in the way that we hoped that it would be. But this Baylor team has now replaced everybody. There's not a single player that was on Baylor's roster last year during that game that is back on this Baylor team next year. Not a single one. Some of that is graduation, going on to the NBA like VJ Edgecombe did. Some of it is guys that maybe would have stayed, but Scott Drew and the staff had some tough conversations and said, hey, I think we want to move in this direction instead. And so they bring in a whole new roster, got some incoming freshman guys coming in that are going to be very good. Tunde Yusufu in particular is outstanding. They add a transfer from Oregon State and Michael Ratai, who was incredible last year for the Beavers. And again, a lot of Gonzaga fans will remember that as he hung 30 on the Zags and Corvallis in that upset loss. But this is a Baylor team that I think is going to be good. And when Gonzaga and Baylor agreed to play last year, it was part of a 3-game series with the intention that one of the games would be in Waco. One of the games, of course, would be in Spokane at the arena as happened. And then the third game would be a true neutral site. It had been floated that it could be Las Vegas. It had been floated that it could be Mexico City for a while. I'm sure the Sanford Pentagon will get discussed as a possibility for that game, maybe depending on the timing. Seattle will get discussed, although I think Baylor probably wouldn't love that, but Scott Drew might be willing to do it. Who knows? Regardless, now it doesn't look like that game's happening at all. And I don't get the impression that Scott Drew is the kind of coach who would shy away from this game. Like, certainly he wouldn't publicly, but even privately, I doubt he's like, let's skip that game. They're going to be too good. Like, that's not the Scott Drew mentality. That's not who he is. It's the same way that I don't think Gonzaga would do that. Like, Mark Few has known when he's had rosters that maybe aren't as good as previous years. He knows that. He's any coach is going to be pretty aware of the high level talent that they have on their roster and the ability to compete. But I rarely see Gonzaga's schedule take a dip at the same time that I think that their actual roster is going to take a dip. And similarly, Baylor, again, they wouldn't go play Louisville, who's a projected top 5 team, if they didn't think that if that was truly something that they were doing. So maybe this is just a logistics thing. Maybe it is just we want to take a break thing for whatever reason. Maybe they're going to schedule it after all. Like, who knows exactly what's going to happen here? But at this point, it's no longer just, I wonder why it hasn't happened yet. It's like, this is clearly a thing. And it seems pretty likely at this point that Gonzaga and Baylor are only going to meet each other this year if it happens to happen in the Players Era Festival or in the NCAA tournament. Looking at the rest of Gonzaga's schedule, I'm going to rattle it off for you here. What we know at this point, again, 11 of those 13 games are fully confirmed at this point. The first game will be on opening day, November 3rd at the Kennel against Texas Southern. Then Gonzaga will take on Oklahoma at the Spokane Arena on November 8th. That is the first in what will end up being a home-and-home series against the Sooners. 3 days later at the Kennel, Gonzaga's true home, they will play Creighton, Greg McDermott, and the Blue Jays. That is also the first in a home-and-home series, which means next year Gonzaga will have road games against both Oklahoma and Creighton. Gonzaga also takes on Arizona State on November 14th. That game is in Tempe, part of a return in the home-and-home series that started last year when Gonzaga beat Arizona State in Spokane. Then we have that reported but not confirmed game against Southern Utah on November 17th at the Kennel. And then after that, we have the 3 games in the Players Era Festival, November 24th against Alabama, November 25th against Maryland, and then November 26th, opponent and game time to be determined based on how they do in those first games. Worth pointing out, by the way, with that Southern Utah game, November 17th is the reported date. If that's not a confirmed game, that means Gonzaga plays at Arizona State November 14th, and then they play Alabama November 24th. There will be a game in between there. If the Southern Utah game is not actually happening on that date, there's not going to be a 10-day gap in the middle of November. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on for where that final game might go, especially if that Southern Utah game ends up being not true or happening at a different time. After the Players Era Festival, Gonzaga will head to Nashville to take on Kentucky at the Bridgestone Arena, the home of the Nashville Flyers in the NHL. This is game 4 in a 6-year series agreed to between these two schools. Gonzaga's up 2-1 in the series with their 2 wins coming against John Calipari's Wildcats and their 1 loss coming to Mark Pope's Wildcats last year in Seattle. 4 days later, Gonzaga returns to Spokane to take on Campbell at the Kennel, and then 4 days after, I missed a game. Speaking of Seattle, December 13th, Gonzaga will be back at the Climate Pledge Arena. This time they will be taking on UCLA, Mick Cronin, and the Bruins. This is the return game in a 2-year series that Gonzaga started last year against UCLA at the Intuit Dome, a game that they lost. They're looking to get a little revenge here and even up that series. Then they take on Campbell. Then 4 days later is when they'll take on Oregon on December 21st at the Moda Center. That is the final confirmed game in Gonzaga's non-conference slate at this point. Again, 11 out of 13 are confirmed. If that Southern Utah game gets finalized, that will be 12 out of 13 games are confirmed, meaning there's just one left. At this point, I don't think it's Baylor, not only because of how little room there is in the schedule, but because Gonzaga seemingly doesn't have as many of those bye games as they typically have. Texas Southern would be considered a bye game. Southern Utah would be considered a bye game, assuming it's happening. And then Campbell would be considered a bye game. That's just 3. Pretty unlikely they only have 3. I think they're going to end up having a 4th bye game. And I think that 4th bye game is going to be somebody along the lines of if it's a local team, it's like a North Dakota, a Montana, maybe a Big West school like CSUN or Fullerton or Cal Baptist or somebody like that, Idaho, perhaps, Sacramento State. Like, that's the kind of team I think it could be. It could end up being another SWAC team, although Gonzaga typically doesn't play too many of those in the same year, and they're already playing Texas Southern. But, maybe it's somebody like North Florida and the ASUN, who they played a few years ago, somebody like that. I think that's going to be your final game. And I think, again, I would make a guess on when it'll be in the schedule. It kind of depends on that Southern Utah game and whether that's the date on that is correct or not. But I would be pretty surprised if Baylor ends up being that final game, and would be more inclined to believe it's going to be a local-ish, mid-major bye game type opponent for their final game of the season. Well, folks, Gonzaga and St. Mary's, they have had a whole lot of battles on the court, but now they got an off-the-court battle for 4-star combo guard JRob Croy, and that is taking center stage. We're going to talk about this recruiting battle and what it means for both programs coming up here in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, closing out the show with a recruiting update for Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs, as they are set to host another recruit in the 2026 class. In fact, we've actually found out since our last recording two prospects in the 2026 class that are set to visit Gonzaga. We're going to talk about JRob Croy on today's show, but we are going to talk about Cameron Holmes, the younger brother of Daron Holmes, who is set to visit on November 7th. He's actually going to be in town for Gonzaga's game against Oklahoma at the Spokane Arena. We're going to get to that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about who Cameron Holmes is on a future episode of Locked On Zags. But for today, we're focusing on JRob Croy. JRob Croy is set to visit Gonzaga on September 12th. So another visit earlier in the cycle for this recruiting visit in the 2026 class. Croy is a 6'5" wing. He's from Polytechnic High School in Riverside, California. He is ranked just outside the top 100 in the 2026 class, according to 247 Sports' most updated rankings. They have him 106th. He's 111th in their composite rankings, and On3/Rivals gave him a big jump. He was like 172nd, I think, in their previous rankings, and they bumped him up to 137th. So he's climbing in their rankings, but he's still sitting outside of that top 100, in their case, outside the top 125. 16th ranked combo guard in the class, according to 247 Sports, and the 11th ranked player in the state of California. However, the big story with Croy, we're going to talk about who he is and his play style here in a second, but the big story is that he officially revealed 2 official visits that he's planning to take. Just 2. Gonzaga on September 12th, but prior to that, he's also going to visit St. Mary's and the Gaels on August 21st. So next week, as many of you are listening to this show. He's indicated Oregon as a potential in the past. I think he is planning to visit them, but it's not been reported as official dates or anything. So it's not like he's already down to 2. He's not just down to Gonzaga and St. Mary's. I know Oregon's in the mix. I know that Clemson is in the mix. USC's in the mix. Recently, Texas A&M got involved in the mix here. So there are a handful of schools. But it was notable that when the graphic came out from 247 Sports, that it showed just Gonzaga and St. Mary's, like battle royale, baby. These two schools are rivals. They've been rivals for a long time. And now they're both two of the top schools in the mix for Croy here. In fact, and On3 / Rivals might just be having a little fun with this. For those of you who know, if you go to the On3 site, they have their recruiting projections, a percentage for each team that is pursuing a player based on how likely they think that player is to end up there. I don't take these all that seriously, not because I think On3 does a bad job, but because trying to project what a 17, 16, 18-year-old is going to do is just a lesson in futility. For almost a year, maybe a full year, the odds that Nick Camino was coming to Gonzaga were over 75%. I think at one point Isaiah Harwell was over 70% coming to Gonzaga. Neither of those guys ended up at Gonzaga. And again, I'm not saying On3 is to blame for that. I'm saying that those kids change their minds because that's what teenagers do. So it's just one of those things that's difficult to do, which is why I think that it might just be a little bit of having a little fun with the fact that the current rankings right now at On3 for JRob Croy show St. Mary's 52.1% and Gonzaga 45.6%, with Clemson and Stanford and a few others all less than 1%. I would imagine that these two schools are in the lead right now, with, again, Oregon, I think, has probably got better odds than On3 is giving them at this point. But yeah, it's a battle between these two programs. The reason St. Mary's has an advantage is not just because Croy is from Riverside and is, generally from California and may want to stay in the area. It's the connection that his family has to St. Mary's. JRob Croy's father is Rick Croy. Rick Croy is the current head coach at Cal Baptist and has been the head coach at Cal Baptist since 2013. JRob's not going to go to Cal Baptist, but his dad's previous stop before taking the head coach job at Cal Baptist was an assistant coach at St. Mary's. He was an assistant coach at St. Mary's from 2010 to 2013. So he spent a decent amount of time there. And I think you have to imagine that the fact that Randy Bennett was the coach there too. If it was a different coach, I would say, I'm not sure that relationship matters all that much. But like Rick Croy is likely close to Randy Bennett and has learned from him. He's a mentor for him. Like those are easily predictable things about the relationship that those two men have with each other. And that's a powerful thing. Like that carries a lot of weight. And if they believe that Randy Bennett is the right person to coach his son, that's going to carry a ton of weight. And Randy Bennett obviously is a phenomenal coach. And certainly, I'm not saying that shouldn't be valued. Mark Few is also a phenomenal coach. And I think maybe a better fit for what Croy is as a player at this point. But yeah, it's going to be hard to dissuade the narrative about the father-son relationship and the mentor-mentee relationship that he may have with Coach Bennett in that situation. And of course, always hard to get guys who have born and raised and grew up in California to leave California for I was going to say not so sunny. Spokane's pretty sunny, but it's not warm. It's not warm there. And sometimes it's a tough sell for kids in that space as well. In terms of who JRob Croy is as a player, he is expected to rise heavily in 247 Sports' updated rankings when they come out, and I think he will probably move up more the next time On3 does an update as well. He played extremely well on the summer circuit. He's long been lauded for his three-point shooting, shot over 40% from three this AAU season. That is his calling card. He is a 6'5" guard who can really light it up and knock him down from deep. But he has shown dramatic improvement recently as a playmaker, and that is what has drawn him major attention. That's what got Gonzaga on the phone. That's what got Clemson on the phone and Texas A&M and USC and other schools like that. They said, okay, you're a 6'5" wing who can shoot it. They're going to play at the D1 level most likely, but that's not necessarily going to be a high profile, we got to get this kid type of recruiting battle. But if you can also play make, and you can truly be a combo guard who can play the one or the two, and you can knock them down, that's going to get you some real attention. That's when those big-time schools start calling. That's when Gonzaga calls. That's when SEC schools like A&M start calling. That's when you start to really get that attention. According to reporting from Max Mendel at 247 Sports, who's done a phenomenal job covering all of these targets for Gonzaga in this 2026 class, Croy is perhaps Gonzaga's top combo guard option. Gonzaga's looking to add a combo guard to to the 2026 class. They're also looking to add like a pure wing, a 3, an athletic finisher type. That's where Cameron Holmes comes in. That's also where Gonzaga's pursuit of players like Tyran Stokes and Baba Oladotun, the top player in the 2026 class in Stokes, and Oladotun, who is now a top 10 player after reclassifying to 2026. Those are guys Gonzaga's going after because they want that athletic wing type. That's also where Hurley Brutus comes into effect, guys like that. Zags are also looking at adding a center to this class. Sam Funches is the target they have really zeroed in on in this class. But Croy is a legitimate player that Gonzaga really wants to bring to Spokane. And he's now one of many visits that is scheduled for Gonzaga up to this point. Here's a rundown on all of the visits and what is going to be an extremely important, crucial late summer, early fall for Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs. First, you have Ethan Harris, power forward from Camas, Washington, 4-star. He's coming to campus on August 29th. Then you got JRob Croy coming September 12th. Then you got Craziness in the Kennel, which is where both Hurley Brutus and Sam Funches, both 4-stars in that 26 class, they're both going to be on campus for Craziness in the Kennel, October 3rd through 5th. Cameron Holmes, who, again, we'll talk more about in a future episode, but we've talked about him a little bit already. He's a 5-star player in this class, 6'6", lefty, very, very good athlete. He's visiting on November 7th. And then you have a couple other players who have said they're visiting but have not announced the dates yet. 2 of them we just talked about, Stokes and Oladotun. The other one is point guard Ikenna Alozie. Alozie listed Gonzaga in his top 8 and has indicated he plans to visit all 8 of the schools on his list, but dates for those visits have not been revealed. They may have been scheduled, but they just have not been revealed publicly at this point. Gonzaga is also pursuing a trio of other wings in this class: Anthony Felici, Bo Ogden, and Luca Foster. Both Ogden and Foster have listed Gonzaga on their lists. I think for Ogden is a top 6 and Foster's a top 9, but neither have set visits to Gonzaga, whereas Felici recently revealed the schools that he's planning to visit, and Gonzaga was not on the list. So probably a player that they're moving on from. But again, I've said that before and been wrong, so you never really know this situation there. Regardless, like we said, very busy couple of months for Mark Few and Brian Michelson and RJ Barsh and Stephen Gentry and the rest of that staff as they try to get these kids on campus and eventually get a few of them to start committing to Gonzaga starting when they join the Pac-12 in that 26-27 season. Folks, that's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Thank you so much to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Always want to give a special shout out to those everyday listeners as well. That's going to be it for this week, unless some big news breaks, and we'll get something out there for you all on that. But next week, we're going to talk more about Cameron Holmes' visit. We'll get some mailbag questions answered if we got some of those coming in. We got some more fun stuff for you lined up as well. Thanks again, folks, for listening. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And of course, as always, go Zags.